welcome to the Prestige Lecture of Prof. Jacques van der Klink. I know it's a big day for him, and many of his colleagues from elsewhere in the world will also join in via YouTube today. So it's really a special occasion for us today. Our program is as follows. First, I will do the welcome and introduction, and then Prof. Jacques will do his Prestige lecture, and then our Dean, Executive Dean, Prof. Dumi Moyo, will do just the last words after the Prestige lecture, and then we will go for refreshments. So I want to welcome a few specific people. Firstly, we took a big chance to invite Mr. Berto Boscha here. He is the Education and Science Attaché of the Netherlands in South Africa, and we actually met him at the World Science Forum in Cape Town in December, and he was so friendly to also agree to attend Prof. Jacques' lecture today. Then I want to welcome Prof. Jacques and his wife Ariane, and also their family members. I know that Prof. Jacques' nephew is also here today, and he is living in the Netherlands and France and South Africa, but he is also here today. Welcome. Prof. Dumi Moyo, I really appreciate, Prof. Dumi, that you make the time. We're just returning from a planning session, and you still are here with us today. Thank you very much to our Executive Dean of the Humanities, Prof. Dumi Moyo, and then Prof. Myrna Nel, who is our Deputy Dean, Research and Innovation. Also, our program leaders, I want to acknowledge them. And as you will see today, it's always dynamic at Optentia, so you can make a slideshow now, and probably you'll find that there's another person that you have not acknowledged that's on the list. So my colleagues, Jaco Hofman, Marita Heinz, Jaapie Greef, Blessed Ngwenya, and Leonie van der Vaart, welcome. And then I can say we knew that Prof. Andries Baart of the Netherlands was on his way here, but he actually made it to the Prestige lecture. So we are so glad, Prof. Andries, and you are here for the next few weeks, also in South Africa, and we are glad to have you today at this Prestige lecture. Then my colleague from the University of Namibia, Annalisa Morangi, she completed her PhD last year, and it's just a sign for us also for the collaboration that we are putting in place with our other universities in Southern Africa, that Annalisa is here today. And she is such a good scholar. We really appreciate that you're here. Academics and researchers who collaborated with Prof. Jacques van der Klink. I noticed, I hope that he's also joining us, Prof. Wilma Schofelli, who was one of our first contacts, I think around 2002, in South Africa at the Noordwes-universiteit. But he is joining via YouTube today, hopefully, and so also some of Prof. Jacques' other colleagues from there. Then my previous and current PhD students who are all working on the capability approach. Some are here, like Annalisa, who completed, Neil Barnard, who completed this year, Suzette Ragado, who will be hopefully submitting this year. I think of people like Tera Lobi, who is unfortunately not here today. Tessa de Wet is probably joining via YouTube. And then also even from Jamaica, we have a PhD, Henry Lewis, and it is myself and Prof. Jacques who is doing the promoting of Henry, and I think he's also joining us via YouTube today. And then colleagues and students, welcome. About Prof. Jacques, he was trained as a medical doctor, qualified as an occupational physician. Actually, I think he told me it's only since this year that he's not reapplying for his medical practitionership in the Netherlands. He has now moved on to other areas, but he was trained as a medical doctor, completed master's and doctoral qualifications in psychology in the Netherlands, and he has a wide range of work experience, not only in universities, I think, at other places as well. And I'm not even going to try to mention his list of publications. I think 3 publications were important for us at Optentia because we were looking for a kind of a unifying approach for our multidisciplinary research focus. And we decided on the capability approach as one of the approaches that we want to develop. And then we came across his work. And so his valedictory address in 2019 is really a good piece of work for anybody who wants to know about his work. And then also the article by Abma et al. In 2016, and then Van der Klink and et al. In 2016, where they sort of first explain the capability approach in a work context very well. My PhD students, I just acknowledge them. Tessa de Wet, Annalisa Morangi, Neil Barnard, Terra Lobe, Henry Lewis, Suzette Regado. Now, as you can see, we are a group of focused researchers in this field and in different kinds of occupations. We are studying things like sustainable employability of people and so on. And it's a wonderful opportunity for our PhDs and also the completed PhDs to meet people like Prof. Jacques and to spend time with him like we did last night. Now, at the World Science Forum in December 2022 in Cape Town, there was a declaration made about science, and you can see the kind of organizations that were involved there. And as I said, there's also where we met Berto. We attended a workshop presented by the Netherlands there, and it was really an eye-opening conference for me to attend, a very valuable conference. But there they made, in this declaration, they talk about science for social justice. And they say, as a responsibility, an opportunity, and a commitment. So there are 5 themes in this declaration, and you can find it on their website of the World Science Forum. The one, the science for human dignity, what role for science there is in fighting poverty, unemployment, inequality, and exclusion. Secondly, this science for climate justice. How can science work with civil society and lead the way in correcting the failure of climate policies? The whole thing of just transitions, for instance. Then science for Africa and the world, how to unleash the potential of African science in global cooperation. The science for diplomacy, how can science reboot materialism, multilateralism, and global solidarity. And then justice in science, how to ensure science reflects the society we want. Now, building on that theme, there's Prof. Jacques and there's his theme. Amartya Sen wrote the book, The Idea of Justice, which is often quoted if you read in the capability literature. Prof. Jacques called his lecture, after thinking about it quite a while, he said to me that he wanted to speak about the sound of justice. So I'm looking forward to that, and he says science should improve the world and not just explain and analyze it. This is congruent to the field of occupational practice and the professionals working there who want, like us, to create flourishing work and not just understand why is work often degrading. Science must provide practical tools to support professionals in their work. Such a pragmatic attitude must be based on a completely clear conceptual framework. Bad theories can dehumanize people. I advocate a deontological framework and a practice in which social justice is central and not financial economic objectives. This corresponds to the capability approach, focusing on valuable and valued life and normativity, diversity, and contextuality. These are themes that you will hear in Prof. Jacques' lecture. Contrary to the common view of distributive justice, he is advocating the idea of contributive justice, which provides more opportunities for an inclusive and diversified work environment, and also adheres to South African lines of thinking in which contribution to a community and togetherness is really important. Right. Prof. Jacques, we're really glad to have you here. We look forward to your prestige lecture. So I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Most honored representatives of Noordwes University, Professor Dumi Moyo, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Mirna Nel, Deputy Dean Research and Innovation of Humanities, Professor Ian Rodman, Director of Aptentia, and the program leaders of Aptentia, Professor Jacco Hofman, Professor Marita Heinz, and Professor Blessing Nguyen. And also a special welcome to Professor Andries Baert and the Dutch Attaché Education and Science of the Dutch Embassy, Mr. Berto Boscha. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome from my side to Noordwes University. I thank the university for the opportunity to address my prestige lecture, and thank you, dear colleagues, friends and family, for attending. Most of you joined virtually from abroad, in fact from all over the world. In this lecture, I will develop 5 lines of thinking. The first line that runs through the argument is how theory and praxis reinforce each other and how this comes together in the capability model for human well-being and the capability model for work. A second line is to further strengthen the element of social justice towards work and health. However, this effort led to a strong personal confusion with regard to the interplay between theory and praxis. This problem could eventually be solved by a significant twist in perspective, namely embracing contributive justice as the central concept of social justice. I will share that quest with you. As a consequence of this, my third line is an attempt to show that the capability approach, with its focus on distributive justice, should be extended to incorporate the idea of contributive justice. In this part of my lecture, I will explain both concepts of justice and provide arguments as to how the proposed extension can be philosophically based. Moreover, I will try to argue that contributive justice, as an integral part of the capability approach, provides more opportunities for an inclusive and diversified work environment, and, in my opinion, also aligns with many non-Western and especially South African ethics or lines of thinking in which contribution to a community, interdependency, and togetherness are important concepts. Fourth, with regards to my views on science and humanity, I start from the normative view that science should improve the world and not just explain and analyze it. In addition, I will start from a positive view of humanity. Finally, I will briefly discuss how our research in Groningen, Tilburg, and in Hortensia have contributed to these overarching themes. The link to the capability approach also offers me to present some of my personal history and development in the field. I had the privilege of contributing to the fields of work and health for almost 40 years, of which about 25 years in practice. My first focus was on mental health. I got to know the capability model when I have had a chair at the University of Groningen. I learned about it initially in the context of global health, and also in Groningen I was able to begin relating the capability model to work and health. When I then moved to Tilburg, I was able to research and to apply the model further. with colleagues and PhD students. In my inaugural lecture address in Tilburg, I set out my plans. 5 years later, in my valedictory address, I presented some of the results and also related and compared the capability model with other models regarding work and health. Now, at Abtentia, I can continue and expand that work. In this lecture, I give a further theoretically deepening in relation to social justice, in particular contributive justice, and also return to the possibilities of practical applications. So, to begin, I would like to start with an anecdote that comes from Amartya Sen's magnificent book, already mentioned by Praveen, The Idea of Justice. In this anecdote, 3 children, Anne, Bob, and Carla, are arguing over who should get a flute. Anne makes the claim to the flute on the grounds that she is the only one of the 3 who knows to play the flute. The others do not deny this. If that's the only information we have, Anne has a strong case. But then Bob takes the floor and says that he is the only one of the 3 who is so poor that he has no toys of his own. The flute would give him something to play with. The other 2 recognize that they are richer and well stocked with toys. If he had only heard Bob, he would have a strong point. But then Carla takes the floor and points out that she had toiled for many months to make the flute. The others confirm this, and therefore she has the right to keep it. If we only heard Carla's argument, we might give her the flute in recognition of her claim to something she had made herself. However, when we hear all three children and their arguments, it's not so easy to make a decision. Distributive justice theorists of different persuasions will each see one clear and just solution. But these respective solutions will each be completely different and point to a different child getting the flute. What we can learn from this story is that there is no unambiguous perspective on social justice, let alone one comprehensive theory that clearly solves all problems. I've given the title of this lecture as The Sound of Justice, because the sound of justice is not one single tone, a uniform tone, but a chord that sounds different from each different perspective. Not only from different distributive justice perspectives, but also from different contexts. In this lecture, I focus on the perspective of work. To start with the music metaphor for a while, to stay with the music metaphor for a while, my song in this lecture will be a battle song, a song to motivate us to keep moving forward, by which I mean that my starting point will be from the normative view that science should improve the world and not just explain and analyze it, as I said in the introduction. This view is fortunately becoming more and more common and also congruent with the fields of occupational practice and the professionals working in the fields who want to create flourishing work and not just understand why work is often degrading or exclusionary for so many people. In this lecture, I will try to defend a twofold thesis. Firstly, science should provide practical tools to support professionals in their work. Secondly, such a normative endeavor about what the world should be like requires a robust and clear conceptual framework. Bad theories, as we know from experiences in diverse fields, can dehumanize people and do great violence, or worse, result in the decimation of peoples. If we are to think about justice as a sound, bad theories produce a horrible sound. The anecdote with the flute and the myriad and deep issues involved are reflected in the title of Sen's book, The Idea of Justice. This title is a tip of the hat to John Rawls, who wrote the profound and now classic treatise called A Theory of Justice. On the one hand, Sen's title reflects that there is no one comprehensive ideal theory of justice. On the other hand, the title reflects Sen's pragmatic view that it is better to start from a real-world or factual situation with an idea of what is just than to pursue a spot on the horizon which may theoretically be perfect but to which no visible roads lead. Sen argues that it may perhaps even be better to have an idea of what is unjust, because we are able to jointly recognize the unjust more easily. But this is where the confusion I mentioned above arose. On the one hand, I fully agree with Sen's statement that there is no general truth and that applies to all situations. On the other hand, by definition, starting from a non-theoretical starting point is contrary to my own experiences of how practice and science are intertwined. As for Sen, whom I consider one of the greatest thinkers and theorists of our time, I can reason that only a very pure or strong theorist can take such a position. It shows that, thanks to this pure and developed intellect, he has remained a positive view of humanity and such a deep-rooted trust in people that human practice can be the starting point for doing justice in the here and now, and the perfect theory is not needed. However, this understanding of Sen's point of view does not solve my problem, described above, that in my experience, the constant interaction between practice and theory has added value, and not by definition starting from a non-theoretically starting point. In my opinion, the solution lies in looking differently at the situation outlined by Sen. He sketches the solution from the point of view of a distribution problem. Who gets the flute? Arising from the idea of distributive justice. However, there are other theories of social justice, and the more recent concept of contributive justice in particular provides a completely different framework. I will return more in detail later to the concepts of distributive justice and contributive justice. For the moment, I will briefly indicate that distributive justice concerns the question who gets what and how much, while contributive justice can be described as the freedom and responsibility each of us has to contribute to civil society and to our collective well-being. This is based on the idea that what we do in life has at least as much influence on who we become and the quality of our lives as does what we get. By way of illustration, I want to transform the thought experiment of the two children and the flute into a frame of contributive justice. The question then is not who gets the flute, but what can the flute contribute to the well-being of the children, and what can they contribute to the realization of a just situation? For the current situation, the latter means that Carla has already made her contribution by making the flute. She undoubtedly made the flute for the purpose that it will be used. Anne and Bob can contribute to that purpose. Perhaps Carla had the idea to make the flute in order to learn how to play it. Anne who is the only one who knows how to play the flute, could play a role in teaching Carla, and maybe also in teaching Bob. A division would then be made that each of the children may use the flute for a number of hours a day or a number of days per week, depending on their needs for use. And for the longer term, one could even fantasize that Carla would start a flute factory where Bob would become a manager and thus rise out of poverty, and that the factory would sponsor Anne in a career as a concert flutist. Ladies and gentlemen, in the above, I have introduced contributive justice as an alternative model to distributive justice that can have a unifying effect by focusing not on what divides people, individual well-being interests, but on what unites them, common participation in governance over the flute. With this, we do indeed have a single and unambiguous theoretical starting point for social justice. Moreover, one that is theoretically and practically unifying and inclusive. So I'm really happy again. With this introduction, however, the concept is not yet well-founded. In the following, I will indicate how the concept originates from and is rooted in existing philosophical traditions, and how contributive justice can be a valuable addition to the capability model. Finally, I will mirror this to how the capability model has helped shape practice. Returning to the story of the flute, Sen jumps off from the story to identify two important ethical movements that originated from the European Enlightenment, that aimed to realize a just society: the social contract thinkers and the realization-oriented thinkers. Oh. No. Excuse me. First, the contract thinkers. In their view, often based on one ideal theoretical model, you need perfectly just social arrangements and institutions grounded in a so-called social contract. This is an implicit and hypothetical agreement about the distribution of power. It can be inferred that the starting point of the contract thinkers is essentially a negative view of men and women. Good behavior is not a natural choice of people, but must be enforced by policies and regulations. Sen identifies two problems with this contract approach. First, there is no accepted agreement about a just society. Second, this approach does not help solve fundamental problems of real-world social injustice. Slavery and apartheid, for example, could have existed despite being evident injustices within a social contract framework legitimized by so-called right institutions and regulations. The other movement, driven by outcome realization thinkers, makes comparisons between different ways in which people's lives can be led, i.e., the actual realization. The outcomes are influenced by institutions, but also by the actual behavior of people, social interactions, and other factors. Sen, clearly an advocate for outcome realization approaches, argues that we should focus on removing injustices that most of or all of us are likely to agree on and that can be alleviated. The starting point is that people make rational choices from a broader perspective than only or primarily self-interest. The public interest is in many cases a voluntary choice of people and does not have to be regulated or enforced in a contract. This reflects a positive view of humanity. I'll come back later to how Sen developed this in his capability approach. Before that, I will firstly say something about perspective on good or right behavior. Regarding right behavior, there can be distinguished two main philosophical perspectives. First, the consequential perspective. I will focus here on utilitarianism, as it is the most important contemporary representative of consequentialism. And second, the deontological perspective, rooted deep in Indian as well as European philosophy, with Kantianism as most important Western representative. In the utilitarian perspective, developed in its classic form by Bentham, Mill and Sidgwick, behavior is considered right if it accomplishes the best possible outcome, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Any action that accomplishes this objective is seen as right, regardless whether or not the action violates the rights of certain actors in the process. Note that the utilitarian perspective on justice does not guarantee justice for all, as there is no guarantee for the rights or the few or minorities of various kinds. If the total happiness outnumbers the unhappiness of a small disadvantaged group, it meets the central premise of utilitarianism. The Kantian perspective on right behavior is different in this important respect. Kant takes a duty and ethical perspective in that morality lies in rightness of the action itself and the obligation one has towards the other, and not in the outcome of that action. Starting point is that autonomous human beings can choose rationally and be held responsible for their choice. Kant stated this premise in several formulations of the categorical imperative. The second formulation, also called the formulation of humanity, states that an actor should always see himself or any other actor as a holder of value in him or herself. Literally, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely see as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Kantian ethics informs the underpinning theory for the formulation of universal human rights in general and the movement for the abolition of slavery in particular. Women's rights, labor rights, and the rights and emancipation of minorities can also only be founded or justified deontologically. Consequential reasoning, despite being entrenched in our contemporary ways of thinking, does not provide a solid base for human rights. Rights are useful for consequentialists, especially utilitarians, if they lead to an overall good outcome, but are not useful otherwise. Adopting the Kantian perspective on right behavior, it can be asked to what extent autonomous individuals will be inclined to act voluntarily in accordance to the Kantian principle. This question refers to the personal agency and the fundamental assumption on the nature of human behavior. And more precisely, is human behavior best perceived as purely driven by self-interest, or can it be argued that actors in their decisions and actions do take the needs and interests of actors into account? This reflects the dichotomy in perspectives discussed above between the contract thinkers and the realization-oriented thinkers. Conceptually, the realization-oriented perspective is closer to the deontological Kantian idea because both share a positive view of humanity and an orientation towards the other. By combining these two perspectives, we arrive at a situation in which deontological ethics is, as it were, implemented in a realization-oriented way. The deontological aspect of seeing every human being as a holder of value and the inclination towards others gives a base for contributive justice. Values can be shared in contribution, not divided in distribution. If you share a value with another person, you don't have each a half value. On the contrary, there's added value in sharing. And the deontological orientation, on the other, also usually implies participation and contribution. Also, the realization orientation implies participation and contribution. So this particular combination allows an idea of justice in which the contribution and thus the inclusion of people in all their diversity is guaranteed with respect for the rights of minorities and all socially excluded people, whether they are the few or the many. Such has been historically the case in South Africa. The resulting concept of contributive justice can be perfectly applied to healthy and flourishing work, an important focus point within Obtentia and also of my share. So I argue that in work and health situations, contributive justice is a well-fitting concept of justice. But within the deontological perspective, also implementation by the contractarian orientation is possible. In fact, this contractarian approach focuses on a fair distribution is the most common form of institutional design, with an emphasis on distributive justice. For the relation between contributive justice and distributive justice, several authors on contributive justice, for example Dempsey, Gomberg and Timmerman, identify a hierarchy between the two, between the more comprehensive concepts of contributive justice and distributive justice as a more narrow form of justice. Contributive justice shapes rightness with its associated entitlements and responsibilities in, for example, an organizational context, thereby serving as a framework for the application of distributive justice. This as a parallel, and might even be rooted in the hierarchy that Aristotle already distinguished between general justice that corresponds to virtue to the community, denoted as rightness, and particular justice aimed at fairness in specific situations, of it distributive justice, already so named by Aristotle, is part. Focusing on organization, and in line with the above, Timmerman states that distributive justice is generally concerned with generating a fair distribution of what is already in existence. By contrast, contributive justice is focusing on bringing opportunities into existence and thus creating values and shaping the organizational context within which fair distribution can take place. Gomberg argues that contributive justice proposes that each flourishes by advancing the flourishing of others. Samagni defines contributive justice as the responsibility each of us has to contribute to civil society and to our collective well-being. Contributive justice matches a person's obligation with his or her capabilities and role in society. Both Morrison and Timmerman have applied contributive justice to work. According to Morrison, complex, interesting work allows workers to develop and exercise their capacities and gain the associated satisfaction and recognition and esteem. It is also, in his eyes, a matter of contributive justice to share these goods and objects to a minority, hoarding all the uninteresting, pleasant tasks and leading the tedious and unpleasant tasks to the rest. Based on the literature, Timmerman identifies 6 central elements of contributive justice, namely opportunities to participate, opportunities to develop skills, opportunities to learn to be predictive, fair evaluation of inputs, the duty to do one's share according to one's capacities, and meaningful work and tedious tasks should be more evenly distributed. An important aspect is that there are entitlements, but also responsibilities and obligations. The entitlements imply that people should be able to shape their own participation or contribution and to move freely between social practices. There should also be the opportunity to develop skills, which leads to satisfaction and self-esteem, and also to participation. Another entitlement is the opportunity to learn to be productive, where it is vital that people are assured that their contributions will be fairly evaluated. Especially for disadvantaged groups, leveling the playing fields will not be enough. People from social disadvantaged groups or people with certain types of disabilities should be given extra resources to reduce the additional burdens they face. A last entitlement is that meaningful work and tedious tasks should be distributed more evenly. In addition to these entitlements, there is the duty to do one's share according to one's capacities. These 6 aspects reflect a combination of normativity, contextuality, in particular rights or entitlements and duties or responsibilities, and the focus on agency and skills for the individual. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with me all this time, because it was hard work. We began with our theoretical line by observing that there is no single or unifying perspective on social justice within a framework of distributive justice. Contributive justice, on the other hand, forms a more unifying and inclusive framework. We have seen 2 views on good behavior, the deontological and the consequential utilitarian view, and saw that deontology is more in line with the aspirations of our fields, which aim to promote the quality and health of work as values in themselves, and not only as means for possible higher productivity. We saw that deontology, in combination with or implemented through the realization-oriented way of thinking, leads to contributive justice as the desired form of social justice. After this theoretical analysis, I will focus on the practice of our research on work and health with the capability approach. I hope to show how much theory and practice converge and reinforce each other in this approach. To clarify the ambitions that have driven our practice, which corresponds to the theory-driven aspirations discussed earlier, I would like to share again a short anecdote with you. That anecdote may be familiar to some of you who have already heard my previous talks, but it is so beautiful that I want to repeat it here. The anecdote is about the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The architect, Sir Christopher Wren, designed and supervised the building of more than 50 churches in London after the Great Fire in 1666. The reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral was his masterpiece. The story begins with Sir Christopher walking among the money workers building the cathedral. Apparently, he was not known by the many workers. As he was surveying the progress of the building, he stopped and asked 3 different workers, all engaged in the same task, what they were doing. And he got 3 different answers. The first said, while acting a bit irritated, "You can see what I'm doing, I'm cutting this stone." The second answered, "I'm earning 3 shillings 6pence today to support my family." The third man straightened up, squared his shoulders and, overlooking the building site, replied, "I'm helping to build the most beautiful cathedral of London." This anecdote illustrates that people have different evaluations of the meaning of their work, varying from work done as an imposed labor and experienced as a burden, via work as a means to acquire income and existence, to work seen as a means to contribute to something of personal and social value. The anecdote shapes my aspirations that all workers be seen as builders of cathedrals of flourishing working lives. A second ambition is for workers to see themselves as cathedral builders. And to clarify my third ambition, I will expand the anecdote a bit. It is tempting to attribute 3 such different answers Sir Christopher got to a difference in personality or upbringing. But we know on theoretical and empirical grounds that the context is often more important than personal characteristics. For example, it could be that the 3 workers are working under contract with 3 different supervisors. The first worker's boss might have said, "Here is a pile of rough stone, and here are your tools. When I come back, I expect a pile of smooth stackable stones." The boss of the second worker may have said, "I know that your wife is sick, and you need extra money for your family. I have a job for you here. It's hard work, but because of that, it's well paid." The boss of worker number 3 may have said, "We are responsible with a group of 5 for that piece of wall of this magnificent cathedral that we are building. There is rough material and tools. It should be carved, carried, stacked, and masoned. You are professionals. See for yourself how you organize your work together within this magnificent project." This is, of course, a fantasy projected from the present to the past, but it clarifies my third ambition, which involves how the immediate social conditions of workers should enable them to be builders of great cathedrals. These three ambitions bring me back to the capability approach that can serve as a vehicle to achieve these ambitions. This value-driven approach focuses on normativity, diversity, and contextuality, as the ontology as contributive does do, and is in line with our normative view of science and our professional fields, in which the ambitions are not optional, but an assignment. I have elaborated on the capability model on many occasions, including in my addresses in Tilburg. I will therefore be relatively brief about it, but will say enough for those who are not familiar yet with the concept and for establishing the relationship with what has been said till now. I will take as a starting point the questions that have always been central to Amartya Sen. These questions are: what is really important for people in their lives, and how to recognize a society that facilitates this? The most general answer to the above questions is that people should have a set of capabilities or a set of diverse freedoms. According to Sen, a capability exists when someone has the freedom to do or to be what she has good reason to value. What people find important in their lives is subjective, and what they are free to do or be is contextual. It is a shared responsibility of the individual and the social context to build and maintain a set of capabilities necessary to realize a valuable life. By formulating the achievement of personal values and goals as a social goal and as entitlements or rights, the capability approach is able to realize the ontological ethics within the consequential reality of everyday life that people and organizations have and should have goals. However, in our society and economy, it is a risk that all activities and services, and especially paid work, are reduced to their strictly economic goals. It is a consequential pitfall to promote services aimed at participation and well-being as if they will always contribute to the efficiency and productivity of employees. That is the economic and not a health and well-being objective. Of course, in many cases, promoting health will contribute to the economic goals of the organization. But the added deontological value of our work precisely is that workers deserve a broader values perspective. But there's also an obligation on the individual to build up and maintain the ability to achieve important goals. This duality of entitlements and responsibility is an important aspect of both the capability approach and of contributive justice. Research shows that for the present-day worker, contributing to something valuable in work is the important aspect of their quality of working life and sustainable employability. So the challenge is, in all workplaces, to identify what the important values are and how people are able and enabled to achieve these values. I will elaborate later on how we took up this challenge. In the capability approach, resources, means to achieve, such as income and wealth, but also health and labor conditions, only have value because of what individuals can be and do through converting such means into valuable outcomes. This precisely reflects the importance of conversion factors in the model. For Sen, equity in capabilities, freedom to achieve important goals people have is important, and not equality in the means or resources, as in most economic and political philosophical theories. Besides being a guiding model within organizations such as the United Nations, the OECD and the World Bank, the capability approach has also found important applications outside the economy, including in health care and education. I had the privilege to share a consortium that applied the capability approach to work and health. In this field, we have hypothesized that increasing capabilities, the freedom to achieve values in work, adds to employees' sustainable employability. This means that the individual worker must be both able and motivated to work. Moreover, the work context must enable the execution of value tasks, contributing to goals that are personally significant and valued by the organization. In the projected figure, the essential elements of the capability model applied to work are visualized. The figure displays that workers have resources or work inputs, such as personal capacities, task structure, and work demands. These work inputs are not determinants of sustainable employability. They are factors that can lead to a set of capabilities, achieved opportunities, provided that appropriate conversion factors are in place. Cutting stone as a work demand, for example, is a burden in itself, but is converted into a lesser burden if seen as contributing to building a great cathedral. At the right side of the model, functionings are the actual outcomes of freedoms or capabilities. Based on this model, 7 work values were identified and validated in a representative population of Dutch employees. Using knowledge and skills, applying knowledge and skills, involvement in important decisions, building and maintaining meaningful contacts at work, setting own goals, having a good income, and contributing to something valuable. This capability set represents the sustainable employability of the worker in his or her work context. Each work value becomes a capability, an opportunity to achieve an important goal or value, if an employee A finds the value important in her work, B is enabled by contextual factors to achieve this work value, and C is able to achieve this work value him or herself. These E, B, and C questions were asked for each value in the work list, and they respectively relate to A, the relevance of value for the employee, B, work conversion factors, and C, personal conversion factors together building a capability. Sen has argued that to establish or identify capabilities should be identified or established in the democratic process of collecting them from the target group and relevant stakeholders in order to respect human diversity and the voice of minorities. In line with this view, for the development of, or maybe better, the identification of the work capability set, a combination of interviews with the target group and expert meetings forms the core. This capability set for work can look to see if people are able and able to achieve important work values, and also to detect the deprivation of work capabilities in the work population. The list showed to be related or to be explanatory for important outcomes such as perceived health, work engagement, workability, intention to stay in the job, person job fit, strengths use, inclusive leadership, and other outcomes. Moreover, it appears to be an apt instrument for enabling a dialogue to help people make aware of what is important to them in work and whether they are enabled to do so. It is an interesting convergence of theory and practice that these items, drawn from practice, reflect a similar combination of normativity, contextuality, in particular entitlements and responsibilities, and the focus on agency and skills that we saw in Timmermans' more theoretically derived elements of contributive justice. In my valedictory address in Tilburg, I elaborated on the results that were made scientifically by the 6 PhD students working on the model and on applying the model for work and health in practice. It is used, the model is used on the individual level in a consulting room by occupational physicians and psychologists. A conversation guide was developed for that use. Moreover, there were applications on the group level and the organizational level. Although I consider the convergence of theory and practice in the capability model to be a focal point of this lecture too, I will not repeat this elaboration here. For those who are interested in these practical applications, I refer to my valedictory address that can be found on the website of Tilburg University. I will now expand on what I said at the beginning of the lecture, the normative view that science should contribute to improving the world and not just explaining it, and how this works out in practice through the capability approach. In mainstream, non-normative science, it is usual to indicate in a general and quantified sense how much a determinant, such as adequate professional help, contributes to sustainable employability or well-being at work. This factor may predict sustainable employability with, for example, 0.41. But in any specific case, this is of little use. Here, in particular situations, the factor adequate help is present or not as a conversion factor, and how to further deal with it is the challenge in that particular situation. And the same applies to many other determinants. The extent to which they contributes to in a general sense to constructs such as sustainable employability is interesting in a restricted, non-action-oriented scientific approach, but it says little about how client and/or professional should deal with a specific situation. In the capabilities model, this contextuality is safeguarded in the conversion factors, which also offer a starting point for interventions. In more clinical situations, the set of complaints is often the starting point for the classical approach. This leads to questions such as, what is the diagnosis? What is the severity of the disease? What is the cause of the disease? And what is the prognosis? A more normative, proactive, and situational approach, in short, the capability approach, leads to questions such as, what limitations do the complaints cause in my situation? How can I deal with this? Do I have the right tools for this? And who can help me to cope with this situation? With these brief sketches of how a good model can support practice as generating the right questions that practice can use, I hope to be able to make clear that I still find the capability model a very suitable model for realizing the ambitions of our fields of work and health, both in science and in practice. In this lecture, I argued for the combination with contributive justice. This fits in well with the purpose of our fields of contributing to work. An important point is in the capability approach is that the distribution aimed at equal opportunities gives a better chance of justice than equal distribution of resources or means. In my opinion, a fair, equal, and therefore inclusive opportunity for everyone to participate forms the contributive framework for such a justice distribution aimed at means or needs and not on resources. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that I have been able to show you that good science and good models are very supportive for a specific practice in which we strive for people to be or become cathedral builders. In my opinion, the capability model is a good framework for this, combined with contributive justice as model of social justice. The choice for these normative models within a normative scientific framework means that our scientific and practical fields cannot be without obligation. We have to ask difficult questions such as, what kind of work is being done? By whom is it performed? And under what circumstances? What do we think of that? What makes us able, willing, and entitled to intervene? The call to activism from an old scientist like me may sound a bit like the roar of a teethless tiger, but it is my experience that the choice of the right models and the right research questions does have an impact on practice and on policymakers. And I see that a number of my PhD students are changing practice because of the good questions. And this country has shown, like no other, that a willing and binding but determined and tenacious pursuit of the good can lead to impressive results. Before I close this substantial part of this lecture and move on to the acknowledgements, I would like to identify one underlying theme, namely that the helpful theories and concepts mentioned in this lecture are all based on a positive view of humanity. In our field of work and beyond, we see many examples of exploitation and other abuses. In my view, in many cases it is because people operating in a consequentialist environment, especially if there are exclusively financial economic goals and targets, direct their behavior towards these goals. In this case, the systems are bad rather than the people. And also empirically, there is a huge amount of research indicated that human behavior is often not merely self-serving, but can be even altruistic. Since McGregor's famous behavioral experiments, we know that pro-social behavior elicits pro-social behavior, and antisocial behavior elicits antisocial behavior. And that also applies to behavioral context. So in a pro-social institutional context, people will be triggered to behave more pro-socially, with an eye for the commons and communality. I'm not so naive as to assume that there are no bad people. They are obvious there, and often in positions of doing great harm. But I think the worst service we can do ourselves and our work, and the best service to those people with malicious intent, is to adopt a negative view of humanity. Then we can no longer see cathedrals, and we can no longer build them. We must not let this happen. And I want to enter my acknowledgement with the ambition of a horizon full of cathedrals and builders of flourishing work. And then, at the very end of this lecture, I want to say a few words of thanks. Due to time, I will be very brief and combine it with the mention of some projects that are currently underway, insofar as they have contributed to this lecture, and also with the situation in South Africa. I express the gratitude I owe to my former colleagues in Groningen, in the consortium, and in Tilburg, in my valedictory address in Tilburg. And those words still apply, so I will not repeat them. As far as current projects are concerned, I still work together in Tilburg, in PhD programs and other projects. I thank the staff there and the PhD students for the great pleasure of working together. In addition, I supervise another PhD student in Amsterdam, and Henry Lewis, together with Professor Ian, at Optentia. Henry adopts the capability set for work for the situation in Jamaica, among other things. Besides Henry, there are other PhD students and projects on the capability approach here in Optentia, on the supervision of Professor Ian Rodman. I had the opportunity to teach 2 extensive courses on the capability model and corporate governance at the University of Addis Ababa, and I now write articles about this relationship with Hans van Ees, professor in Groningen. The almost weekly exchanges with him have contributed a lot to my thinking about social justice. At the beginning of the lecture, I indicated that the ideas I wanted to discuss were in line with South African ideas, in which contribution to a community, interdependence, and togetherness are important concepts. In South Africa, this is related to the Ubuntu way of thinking that helped shape the modern South Africa and stood at the cradle of the non-violent transition from the detrimental system of apartheid into a renewed democratic country, with all its challenges, which I see, of course, but also with all its opportunities. Important leaders like Mandela and Tutu, my absolute personal heroes, were rooted in this way of thinking and were a shining example not only in this country, but for the entire world. From the perspective of the realization thinkers that I mentioned earlier in this lecture, Ubuntu is an important realization of how people are looking for justice in practice. Contributive justice, in my view. The capability model and contributive justice might provide a base for a philosophical underpinning for the impressive practice of Ubuntu. But, of course, African thinkers have to decide about that and not me. It is precisely because of this connection with and the inspiration by South African thinking that I experience that I'm personally honored and motivated to further develop thoughts here, to develop these thoughts here. And I'm grateful to Noordwes-Universiteit for giving me this opportunity. Professionally and personally, Professor Ian Rotman is a shining example for me and embodies the positive spirit, in my view, of South Africa at the stage of Noordwes-Universiteit, especially Oplentia. On that stage, Ian builds cathedrals of collaboration, contribution, and inclusion with a positive drive, friendliness, openness, and compassion that characterizes the bright side of this country, in my view. I consider it a great privilege to have met Ian and to work with him. That positive spirit is also visible in many other people at Noordwes-Universiteit and in Oplentia. We see here McGregor in practice. I mention only Professor Jacques Hofman and Lynn Boyson to honor them all these people at Oplentia and Noordwes-Universiteit. There are two other people who are very special to me as good friends and good colleagues. Gert-Jan van der Wild and Sridhar Venkatapuram have been a professional source of inspiration over years and very good friends. Both Gert-Jan and Sridhar have been invaluable to this address, providing valuable feedback and advice. I thank my nephew Hans for his presence here. My cousin Hans. And last but not least, Ayana, the love and the meaning of my life. And now also, in the most literal sense, my stabilizing factor. I couldn't have come here without her. Despite her enormous fear of flying, she made this possible for me, because she knew how important it was to me. Thank you, my love. And with you, I also thank our children-in-law and grandchildren who teach me every day with a perfect harmony, that in a perfect harmony, the sound of love always resonates with the sound of contribution and the sound of justice. Thank you.
Prof. Jacques, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. And thank you also for the new work that you are generating for us, because we look forward to work on many of the themes that you have suggested here. I'm going to ask our Executive Dean, Prof. Dumi, to just close the ceremony and award your certificate.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ian, and good afternoon to all of you. It is such great pleasure for me to listen to you again after that wonderful presentation you gave to us when we visited Utrecht in October last year. To me, this is a very timely lecture for us today here in South Africa, at a time where issues of social justice, inequality, poverty, and unemployment are so acute. I think most of you would know that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies on the planet. In fact, it's right at the top. I want to congratulate and thank you for such a highly thought-provoking presentation. And I can assure you that far from the empty roar of a toothless old tiger, I want to assure you that far from the empty roar of a toothless old tiger, as you suggest, your lecture makes a highly compelling proposition for socially relevant science and for combining sense capability approach with the contributive justice model as a means to achieving greater social justice, not only in the workplace, but in many other contexts as well. I think one of the attributes of good theory is not just in its beautiful sounding, but its adaptability to explain other related phenomena. I could not avoid reflecting, as you presented, on how thinking about redress in the post-apartheid South African context could benefit from a contributive justice approach, instead of just using distributive justice alone, which has not yielded much positive result. At the same time, I just wondered whether an accommodation of both redistributive and contributive approaches could be more preferable to abandoning one for the other. What would that look like? If we replaced the flute in your lecture with the land, one of the most contentious issues here in South Africa, of course, how differently would this reframe the debate if we asked, what can the land do to the collective people of South Africa, instead of who gets what land, where, how much, and so forth? It seems to me, from listening to your lecture, that the contributive justice model takes us beyond those critical political economy questions of who gets what, how much, etc., to start imagining collaborative ways of problem solving in a world marked by individualism, self-interest, greed, conflict, and so on. It is an approach that is, in our context, easily relatable because it fits squarely within the philosophy of Ubuntu, which emphasizes unity in diversity. I am because we are. And that ability to see value in every human being. Yet a redistributive justice approach may continue to have a strong appeal to many, especially in contexts where extreme historical injustice abounds. What is most fascinating to me in this lecture is the strong emphasis on what could be, on the normative as a potential corrective force, on the possibility of multiplying cathedral builders and overcoming systemic injustice. It is a lecture of hope in an increasingly hopeless world, but one that remains alive to the imperfections alive to the imperfections of both systems and human beings. So I want to say congratulations, Professor Jack, and thank you once again for a highly stimulating lecture. It is indeed an honor for us here at the Northwest University to host you and to host this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Dumi. Can I please ask that we just give the certificate that we have made in a special form to Jacques' wife rather than him. I don't know whether you know, but Jacques broke his ankle in December, so it's really difficult for him to move at this stage. And despite that difficult situation, he still delivered his prestige lecture today. So, Ariane, can you please receive it? Yeah, so you can just, so it's over to you.
Thank you very much for your hospitality. Yeah. Okay, check.
Congratulations.
What's it there?
Colleagues, with that, we are at the end of our prestige lecture. Thanks again for attending, and let's invite you to join us for some refreshments. Thank you very much.